On the morning of November 12, 1871, servants entering the Great Hall of Glengarriff Lodge in County Cork, Ireland discovered their employer, Sir Edmund Ashworth-Price, pinned to the floor beneath 17 mounted stag heads. Each antler display, some weighing upward of 40 pounds, had fallen from the walls in perfect synchronization during the night. The baronet's body lay in a spreading pool of blood, pierced through by no fewer than 8 separate antler points that had entered his torso, neck, and skull with what the coroner would later describe as impossible trajectories. The mounted heads surrounded Sir Edmund in an almost perfect circle. Their glass eyes, witnesses reported, all seemed to stare directly at his corpse. The brackets that had held them, wrought iron fixtures anchored into solid oak paneling, showed no signs of structural failure. No earthquake had shaken the countryside. No intruder had been detected, but the truth was far more terrifying than any simple accident could explain. Before we uncover the truth about the Glengarriff tragedy and the dark secret that connects those 17 stags to Sir Edmund's violent death, make sure to subscribe to Fear Sermon and ring that notification bell so you never miss our investigations into history's darkest mysteries. Drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from. We love hearing from our community of mystery seekers around the world. Now let's step back to Victorian Ireland, where privilege and cruelty were about to collide in the most horrifying way imaginable. Ireland in 1871 existed in the shadow of the Great Famine, still recovering from the devastation that had reduced its population by nearly a quarter, while tenant farmers struggled to survive on increasingly subdivided plots of land. The Anglo-Irish aristocracy maintained their massive estates with ruthless efficiency. The year 1871 marked a particularly tense period. The Fenian Rising was a recent memory, and agrarian unrest simmered across the countryside as secret societies organized resistance against absentee landlords and their often brutal land agents. Glengarriff, situated in the lush coastal region of West Cork, was considered one of the most beautiful locations in Ireland. The village sat nestled between mountains and sea, where ancient oak forests gave way to sheltered harbors. It was here, on a sprawling estate of some 12,000 acres, that Sir Edmund Ashworth-Price maintained his hunting lodge, a limestone mansion built in the Georgian style, with 32 rooms and grounds that included some of the finest deer forest in the British Isles. Sir Edmund, aged 43 at the time of his death, was the 3rd baronet of his line. His grandfather had acquired the estate during the Cromwellian confiscations, seizing land that had belonged to Irish Catholic families for centuries. Edmund himself had inherited the property in 1865, and by all accounts of his class, he was an exemplary sportsman. He hosted shooting parties for visiting English nobility, maintained a kennel of prized hunting dogs, and took particular pride in his collection of trophy kills. The great hall where he would meet his end served as a shrine to his prowess. The 17 stag heads mounted on its walls represented only a fraction of his lifetime kills. These were his imperial stags, red deer whose antlers boasted 12 or more points each. According to the estate's game books, Sir Edmund had personally killed over 300 deer during his 6 years as master of Glengarriff. But there were whispers in the village, stories that rarely reached the ears of the gentry, but circulated among the tenant farmers and domestic staff. Stories about Sir Edmund's hunting methods, about his treatment of the animals, about something that went beyond mere sport into territory that even other aristocratic hunters found disturbing. The local parish priest, Father Donald O'Brien, had been heard to comment that Sir Edmund showed a peculiar cruelty in his pursuits, but such observations carried little weight against a man of the baronet's standing. In the rigid hierarchy of Victorian Ireland, a priest's concerns about an Anglo-Irish landlord's character would go unheeded, particularly when that landlord contributed generously to the local Protestant church and maintained cordial relationships with the Crown authorities in Dublin. Something else lurked beneath the surface of Glengarriff's manicured respectability. The estate workers spoke, in hushed tones, of strange sounds emanating from the great hall on certain nights, of Sir Edmund spending hours alone among his trophies, drinking brandy and conducting what his head gamekeeper, Thomas Riley, described as conversations with the departed. The autumn of 1871 had been particularly active. Sir Edmund had killed 4 stags in October alone, bringing them down with his preferred method, a shot to the hindquarters that would wound but not immediately kill, allowing him to track the injured animal for miles through the forest before delivering the final shot. His hunting journal, later examined by authorities, contained detailed descriptions of each hunt, including notations about how long each deer had taken to die and observations about their behavior during their final moments. The first incident occurred on October 18, 1871. Margaret Donnelly, a housemaid in Sir Edmund's employ, reported to the housekeeper that she had entered the great hall at dawn to begin her cleaning duties, and found all 17 stag heads turned to face inward, toward the center of the room. She was adamant about this detail. The mounted heads, which had been positioned to gaze outward along the walls, as was customary, were now oriented as if watching something in the middle of the hall. The housekeeper, Mrs. Elizabeth Garrett, a Protestant woman from Dublin who had served the household for 12 years, dismissed Margaret's claims as Irish superstition. She personally inspected the Great Hall and found the trophies in their normal positions. Margaret was reprimanded for spreading papist nonsense and warned that another such incident would result in dismissal without references. The young woman, aged 19 and supporting 3 younger siblings after her parents' death, could not afford to lose her position. She said nothing more, but she wasn't the only one who noticed something amiss. On October 23rd, Thomas Riley, the head gamekeeper, discovered something disturbing while conducting his morning rounds of the trophy room adjacent to the Great Hall. The mounted heads were stored there before being displayed, and Riley maintained meticulous records of each kill. That morning, he found droplets of what appeared to be blood on the floor beneath the storage shelves. Fresh blood, still wet, though no mounted head had been added to the collection in over a week. Riley examined each trophy carefully. The preservation work had been done by Gerald Morrison, a taxidermist from Cork City whose work was highly regarded throughout Ireland. The mounting was expert, the preservation complete. There was no source for the blood. Yet there it was, pooled on the wooden floorboards in 17 separate locations, one beneath each of the stags that would eventually hang in the Great Hall. Thomas Riley was not a superstitious man. At 53, he had spent his entire adult life managing Sir Edmund's game. He understood the natural world, understood deer and their habits, understood the biology of death and preservation. But he also understood when something defied natural explanation. He collected a sample of the blood in a vial and took it to Dr. Henry Ashford, the estate physician who maintained a surgery in the village. Dr. Ashford's analysis, documented in his personal diary which would later be submitted as evidence, confirmed the substance was indeed blood. Mammalian, most likely from a large deer. But the blood was fresh, no more than a few hours old. When Riley explained the impossibility of this finding, Dr. Ashford suggested that perhaps one of the preservation chemicals had liquefied and only resembled blood. Neither man found this explanation convincing, but neither could offer an alternative. The third incident occurred on November 3rd. Sir Edmund hosted a hunting party for 3 visiting gentlemen from England, Lord Christopher Weatherby, Mr. James Ashton, and Captain Robert Delafield of the Royal Irish Constabulary. After a successful day's hunt that resulted in 2 stag kills, the party retired to the Great Hall for brandy and cigars. According to testimony later provided by all 3 guests, at approximately 10:15 p.m., a sound echoed through the Great Hall that Captain Delafield described as the most unnatural and disturbing noise I have encountered in 20 years of military service. All 3 men characterized it as a sort of bellowing, similar to a stag's rutting call, but multiplied and overlapping, as if multiple animals were calling in distress simultaneously. The sound seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, specifically from the area where the 17 mounted heads were displayed. Sir Edmund, who had consumed a considerable quantity of brandy, responded to his guest's alarm with what Lord Weatherby described as uncharacteristic agitation. The baronet stood, walked to the center of the Great Hall directly beneath the mounted trophies and shouted, "I am master here. You are dead. You will be silent." The bellowing stopped immediately. An uncomfortable silence descended over the party. Sir Edmund's guests departed the following morning, declining his invitation to stay for additional days of hunting. Captain Delafield would later testify that he felt a presence of malevolent intelligence in that hall, and that Sir Edmund's behavior suggested a man under severe psychological strain. The fourth and final incident before the tragedy occurred on November 10th, just 2 days before Sir Edmund's death. Mrs. Garrett, the housekeeper, was conducting her evening rounds when she passed the Great Hall at approximately 11 p.m. She distinctly heard Sir Edmund's voice from within, though he was supposed to be alone. The housekeeper, concerned that her employer might be ill or in distress, approached the door. What she heard stopped her cold. Sir Edmund was indeed speaking, but in response to other voices. voices that Mrs. Garrett described as bestial in nature, neither quite human nor quite animal, but somehow containing intelligence and articulation. Years later, in an interview with the Irish Folklore Commission, Mrs. Garrett would provide more detail. It sounded as though he was engaged in an argument. His voice was pleading, defensive, and the other voices, there were many of them, speaking over each other. They sounded angry, accusatory. I heard distinctly the word suffering repeated many times. Mrs. Garrett retreated to her quarters without investigating further. She spent a sleepless night, and the following day debated whether to notify Sir Edmund's family solicitor in Cork City about her employer's apparent mental deterioration. She decided against it, reasoning that a servant's concerns about her master's late-night soliloquies would not be taken seriously, and might again be dismissed as Irish superstition. On the evening of November 11th, Sir Edmund dismissed all servants early, instructing them not to disturb him under any circumstances. He locked himself in the Great Hall at approximately 8 p.m. Margaret Donnelly, whose sleeping quarters were in the servants' wing directly above the Great Hall, reported that she heard sounds throughout the night, crashes, Sir Edmund's voice raised in what might have been anger or terror or both, and that same terrible bellowing that had frightened the hunting party guests. At approximately 3 a.m., all sounds ceased. The silence, Margaret would later say, was somehow worse than the noise had been. She lay awake until dawn, too frightened to investigate. If this story is giving you chills, hit that like button and let us know in the comments if you believe places can hold the memory of violence. Share this with someone who loves dark mysteries from history. Now let's discover what the servants found when they opened those doors, and why the investigators who examined the scene concluded that Sir Edmund's death was impossible by any natural means. At 7:30 a.m. on November 12, 1871, when Sir Edmund had not emerged from the Great Hall by his customary breakfast hour, Mrs. Garrett instructed Thomas Riley to check on the master. The head gamekeeper found the door still locked from the inside. When repeated knocking produced no response, Riley made the decision to force entry. He shouldered the heavy oak door until the internal lock gave way. The scene that greeted them would be described in official reports, witness testimonies, and 3 separate newspaper accounts. Yet all these descriptions fail to fully capture the geometric impossibility of what had occurred. Sir Edmund Ashworth-Price lay on his back in the precise center of the Great Hall's floor, his arms spread wide in a position that several witnesses compared to crucifixion. The 17 mounted stag heads that had adorned the walls now lay arranged in a perfect circle around his body, each head positioned with its antlers pointing inward toward the corpse. The brackets that had held them remained anchored to the walls. The mounting plates had somehow separated from the brackets without bending, breaking, or showing any signs of force. 8 separate antler tines had penetrated Sir Edmund's body. The first had entered his right shoulder, passing through the clavicle and puncturing the subclavian artery. The second and third had pierced his abdomen, entering at slightly upward angles that perforated both intestines and liver. The fourth had entered his left thigh, severing the femoral artery. The fifth had pierced his right eye socket, penetrating approximately 3 inches into the brain cavity. The sixth and seventh had entered his throat from opposing angles, creating a cross pattern that nearly severed the head from the neck. The eighth had entered directly through the sternum, passing between the ribs to pierce the heart. Dr. Henry Ashford, summoned immediately to the scene, recorded in his official report that the angles of penetration presented anatomical impossibilities. For the antlers to have entered Sir Edmund's body from above, as they would have if the mounted heads had simply fallen from the walls, the tines would have struck at roughly perpendicular angles. Instead, many had entered at sharp oblique angles, some nearly parallel to the floor, as if the heads had somehow maneuvered themselves while falling to ensure maximum destructive penetration. Furthermore, the force required to drive antler tines through bone and deep tissue exceeded what simple gravitational fall could generate. Dr. Ashford calculated that for the sternum penetration alone, a force of at least 500 pounds per square inch would have been necessary. A 40-pound mounted head falling from a 12-foot height could not generate such force. But perhaps most disturbing were Sir Edmund's hands. His right hand clutched a letter, later found to be a confession he had been writing throughout the night. His left hand was raised and positioned as if warding off something approaching from above. The expression frozen on his face, clearly visible despite the extensive facial trauma, was one of recognition and terror. Multiple witnesses, including Captain Delafield, who was summoned from Cork City to investigate, noted that Sir Edmund appeared to have seen his death coming and knew what it was. The scene told a story of prolonged torment. Forensic examination revealed that not all the wounds were immediately fatal. The punctures to the abdomen, thigh, and shoulder would have caused severe bleeding, but death would have taken minutes, possibly as long as 15 to 20 minutes. The throat wounds appeared to have been inflicted next, followed finally by the sternum and eye socket penetrations, which would have caused nearly instantaneous death. Most inexplicably, there was no blood splatter on the walls or ceiling, as would be expected from such violent trauma. The blood had pooled beneath and around Sir Edmund's body in concentric circles that matched the arrangement of the stag heads with unsettling precision. It was as if the mounted trophies had fallen in a specific sequence, each one striking its target before settling into its final position in the circle. The investigation team, led by Captain Delafield, and including Dr. Ashford, the county coroner, Dr. Patrick Cunningham, and Inspector James Sutherland from the Royal Irish Constabulary, spent 4 hours examining the scene before Sir Edmund's body was removed. Their official report, filed on November 15, 1871, acknowledged that the death presents features which current scientific understanding cannot adequately explain but stopped short of suggesting supernatural causes. However, Dr. Cunningham's private notes, donated to the Cork City Archives in 1923 after his death, revealed his true assessment. "I have examined the bodies of murder victims, accident victims, suicide victims, and those who died by natural causes for 32 years. I have never encountered a death that so clearly suggested intentional killing by an intelligence, yet where all evidence points to the physical impossibility of human agency. If I believed in such things, I would say those animals took their revenge." The letter clutched in Sir Edmund's right hand provided the key to understanding, if not explaining, the tragedy. Written in increasingly erratic handwriting that deteriorated from neat copperplate to barely legible scrawl, the confession detailed Sir Edmund's hunting practices in disturbing specificity. The document, entered into evidence and later published in excerpts by the Cork Examiner newspaper, revealed that Sir Edmund's hunting methods went far beyond the conventional practices of Victorian sport hunting. He had, by his own admission, developed what he termed the art of prolonged pursuit over his 6 years at Glengarriff. Rather than killing deer cleanly, he deliberately inflicted non-fatal wounds that would cause maximum suffering while ensuring the animal could still run. He would then track the wounded stag for hours, sometimes days, observing its deterioration and eventual collapse from exhaustion and blood loss. "I have perfected the science of suffering," Sir Edmund wrote in the letter's most damning passage. "Each animal teaches me something new about the nature of terror, about the precise moment when hope extinguishes and only pain remains. I have documented 317 individual kills, noting the duration of pursuit, the specific nature of wounds inflicted, and the behavioral changes observed as death approached. This is not mere sport. This is systematic study of mortality itself." The confession revealed something else. Sir Edmund was aware of the gathering presence around him. "They have been watching me," he wrote. "For weeks now I sense them in the Great Hall. My trophies are no longer mere mounted heads. They observe. They remember. Last night they spoke to me clearly for the first time. They presented their case, each of the 17 articulating the specific circumstances of their death, the duration of their suffering, the terror they experienced. They demand recompense. They demand I experience what I inflicted upon them." The letter's final lines, written in handwriting so shaky as to be nearly illegible, read, "They are falling now. One by one. They have shown me what they intend. I cannot move. I am frozen here as they were frozen in their final moments. This is justice. This is what I have earned. May God forgive me, for they will not." The investigation expanded beyond the immediate circumstances of death to examine Sir Edmund's activities throughout his tenure at Glengarriff. Thomas Riley, the head gamekeeper, provided testimony that both supported and expanded upon Sir Edmund's confession. Riley confirmed that the baronet's hunting methods were unusual and disturbing, but stated that he had objected multiple times and been threatened with dismissal. "I needed the position," Riley testified. "I have 7 children. Sir Edmund knew I could not afford to lose my employment, and he used that knowledge to ensure my silence about practices I found abhorrent." The investigation uncovered Sir Edmund's detailed hunting journals, which filled 23 leather-bound volumes stored in the estate's library. These journals represented a comprehensive record of systematic cruelty spanning 6 years and hundreds of animals. Each entry documented not just the kill, but Sir Edmund's observations about the animal's suffering, calculations about wound severity versus mobility, and what he termed behavioral degradation indices that tracked how terror affected the deer's decision-making during pursuit. Dr. Ashford, examining these journals at the investigation's request, provided expert analysis that shocked even the hardened police officials reviewing the case. These documents reveal a mind obsessed not with hunting as sport, but with suffering as an object of scientific inquiry, Dr. Ashford wrote in his supplementary report. Sir Edmund had essentially developed an experimental protocol for inflicting and measuring animal suffering. The level of systematic cruelty documented here exceeds anything I have encountered in medical or legal literature. The legal proceedings following Sir Edmund's death proved complex. The initial question was whether to classify the death as accident, suicide, or murder. The coroner's inquest, convened on November 20, 1871, heard 5 days of testimony from witnesses including all household staff, Dr. Ashford, Thomas Riley, and the 3 English gentlemen who had been present for the bellowing incident. Dr. Patrick Cunningham, serving as coroner, ultimately returned a verdict of death by misadventure under circumstances which current evidence cannot adequately explain. This carefully worded finding acknowledged the physical impossibility of the death while avoiding any official endorsement of supernatural causes. The verdict satisfied no one. It was too vague for those seeking rational explanation, yet too carefully hedged for those willing to accept paranormal involvement. The question of Sir Edmund's estate presented additional complications. His will, executed in 1869, left the property to his younger brother, Henry Ashworth-Price, a barrister in London. Henry traveled to Glengarriff to claim his inheritance, but lasted less than 3 weeks before returning to England and placing the entire estate up for sale. He refused to discuss his reasons publicly, but his solicitor let it be known that Henry had experienced disturbing phenomena in the Great Hall and would not spend another night under that roof. The sale of Glengarriff Lodge proved impossible. Despite the estate's considerable acreage and valuable hunting grounds, no buyer could be found. Word of the circumstances surrounding Sir Edmund's death had spread throughout Anglo-Irish society, and the property gained a reputation as cursed. The 17 mounted stag heads, still arranged in their death circle, remained in the Great Hall where they had fallen. Henry's initial attempt to have them removed was abandoned after 3 different workmen refused to touch them, claiming they felt malevolent resistance when approaching the trophies. By 1873, the estate stood completely abandoned. The tenant farmers continued working their plots, paying rent to Henry's agent in Dublin, but the main house fell into disrepair. Local people reported seeing lights in the Great Hall on certain nights, always in November, always around the anniversary of Sir Edmund's death. These reports persisted for decades. Father Donald O'Brien, the Catholic priest who had earlier noted Sir Edmund's peculiar cruelty, attempted to bless the Great Hall in 1874 at the request of several parishioners who lived nearby. According to his letter to the Bishop of Cork, later archived at the diocesan offices, Father O'Brien experienced such profound unease during the blessing that he was unable to complete the ritual. "I felt the presence of accumulated suffering in that room," he wrote. "Not evil precisely, but justice, harsh, uncompromising, and entirely outside the bounds of Christian mercy. Those animals dispense their own form of judgment, and I cannot bring myself to oppose it, though it troubles my theology deeply." The investigation also revealed the extent to which Sir Edmund's practices had been known but ignored by his social peers. Captain Delafield's confidential report to the Royal Irish Constabulary Headquarters, discovered in police archives in the 1950s, acknowledged that multiple members of the Anglo-Irish gentry were aware of Sir Edmund's hunting methods, found them distasteful, but took no action to intervene or report them, as the treatment of game animals on private estates is considered outside the purview of law enforcement and a matter of landowner prerogative. This admission highlighted a broader systemic issue. Victorian Ireland's rigid class hierarchy meant that aristocratic cruelty toward animals, indeed often toward people, faced no legal or social consequences. Sir Edmund's systematic torture of hundreds of deer over 6 years continued unimpeded because no mechanism existed to challenge a wealthy landowner's conduct on his own property. The Glengarriff tragedy occurred at a pivotal moment in the development of animal welfare consciousness in the British Isles. The first animal cruelty legislation, the Cruel Treatment of Cattle Act, had been passed in Britain in 1822, and the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, later the RSPCA, was founded just 2 years later. However, these protections applied primarily to domesticated animals and did little to regulate how wild game was killed on private estates. Sir Edmund's death and the subsequent investigation provided disturbing evidence for reformers arguing that hunting regulations needed to address not just conservation but also the ethical treatment of game animals. The case was cited in parliamentary debates in 1873 and 1876 regarding amendments to game laws. Though no significant legislative changes resulted, the British aristocracy's hunting prerogatives remained largely untouched by legal restrictions until well into the 20th century. However, the Glengarriff incident did have more immediate effects on Irish hunting culture. Several major estates in Cork, Kerry, and Galway revised their hunting protocols in the wake of Sir Edmund's death, implementing rules requiring clean kills and prohibiting the tracking of wounded game beyond a certain time limit. Whether this resulted from genuine ethical concern or superstitious fear of similar supernatural retribution varied by estate, but the practical effect was a reduction in deliberately cruel hunting practices, at least among some landowners. The case also contributed to growing tensions between the Anglo-Irish gentry and Irish Catholic population. For many Irish tenant farmers and villagers, Sir Edmund's death represented a form of cosmic justice, the oppressor destroyed by his own trophies, the instruments of his cruelty turning against him. This interpretation carried obvious political metaphors in an Ireland increasingly restive under British rule. Folk songs about the Glengarriff stags appeared within months of the incident. 1. Collected by the Irish Folklore Commission in the 1930s from elderly informants who remembered it from their childhood, included the verse, 17 hearts with antlers proud, took their vengeance clear and loud. The master who caused such pain and woe met justice from the beasts below. On Glengarriff's cold November morn, the hunter fell, by antlers torn. The abandoned Glengarriff Lodge became something of a dark pilgrimage site. Visitors reported throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries that the 17 stag heads remained in the Great Hall, still arranged in their perfect circle, seemingly untouched by decay or deterioration despite the building's general collapse around them. Multiple attempts to remove or destroy the mounted heads failed. Workmen reported tools breaking, mysterious injuries, and overwhelming sensations of dread that prevented them from completing their tasks. The estate was finally sold in 1921 to the newly formed Irish Free State government, which planned to break it up for land redistribution. The Great Hall was demolished in 1923, and the 17 mounted stag heads were reportedly burned in a bonfire, along with other materials from the destruction. However, multiple witnesses to the demolition claimed the mounted heads showed resistance to fire, requiring repeated attempts and extremely high temperatures before they finally caught flame. From a psychological perspective, the Glengarriff case has been analyzed as an example of extreme guilt manifestation. Some researchers have suggested that Sir Edmund's confession letter and his paralyzed state during the attack indicate he may have orchestrated his own death as a form of suicide, driven by overwhelming guilt. This theory proposes that Sir Edmund somehow arranged the mounted heads to fall in their particular configuration, positioning himself deliberately to be impaled, though it fails to explain the physical impossibilities documented by investigators or the sequence of wounds suggesting prolonged attack rather than simultaneous impact. Paranormal researchers, particularly those interested in what might be termed retributive hauntings, consider the Glengarriff incident a significant case study. The apparent intelligence behind the attack, the systematic nature of the wounds mirroring Sir Edmund's own systematic cruelty, and the multiple witnesses to escalating supernatural phenomena prior to the death, all suggest an organized supernatural response rather than random psychic activity. The case raises profound questions about consciousness, suffering, and the possibility of some form of persistence beyond death. If one accepts the evidence as presented, and the multiple credible witnesses, official documentation, and physical impossibilities make dismissal difficult, then the Glengarriff incident suggests that prolonged, systematic suffering may create some form of imprint or entity capable of recognition and agency. The 17 stags apparently retained not just awareness, but also the capacity for coordinated action toward a specific goal, making their killer experience precisely what he had inflicted upon them. Modern ethical debates about hunting, animal consciousness, and the capacity of animals to suffer and remember suffering often reference the Glengarriff case, though usually in footnotes or as historical curiosity rather than serious evidence. Nevertheless, the The case stands as a documented instance where the assumed power dynamic between human and animal reversed with catastrophic consequences for the human who had abused that power. What do you think drove the 17 stags to their coordinated revenge? Was this supernatural justice, or did Sir Edmund's guilt create a psychological break that led him to orchestrate his own elaborate death? Leave your theories in the comments below. Our community always brings fascinating perspectives to these historical mysteries. The Glengarriff tragedy reminds us that cruelty, whether toward animals or humans, creates ripples that extend far beyond the immediate victims. In Victorian Ireland, Sir Edmund Ashworth-Price believed his wealth and status exempted him from consequences. The 17 stags in his great hall proved otherwise. If this story gave you chills, make sure you're subscribed to Fear's Sermon so you never miss our deep dives into history's darkest chapters. Hit that notification bell, share this video with someone who appreciates historical mysteries, and join us next time as we uncover another lost story that reveals uncomfortable truths about human nature and the things we'd rather forget. The Great Hall of Glengarriff Lodge is gone now, demolished almost a century ago. But the questions it raises remain. How much suffering can be inflicted before it transforms into something with weight, presence, and intention? And if the dead can indeed remember, what might they be planning for those who wronged them? Until next time, this has been Fear's Sermon. Sleep well, if you can.